Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Well, welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters. We're recording this on Friday, the 7th of June. It's been quite an eventful week. Richard, how are you going? What have you been up to this week?
I'm not too bad. I've been snowed under with teaching and things like this, so I've not been jet setting around in quite the way that you have. What have you been up to?
Not sleeping, number one. Not meeting the deadlines, I promise, number two. But I have been at the Shangri-La Dialogue, so I was lucky enough to go there as part of the Australian delegation as the non-government young leader. Apparently I look more youthful than I am. And I've been in Indonesia this week talking about the Indonesia-Australian Maritime Cooperation on the 75th anniversary of our diplomatic relationship with Indonesia. So, it's been a bit of a week.
Wow, sounds interesting, exciting, lots of things. One of those things is obviously one of the key topics we want to be talking about today. So do you want to kick us off talking about Shangri-La?
Yeah, right. Shangri-La. Look, fantastic to be in the room. In fact, somebody sent me a meme of me sitting behind the PLA colonel who chose to ask Richard Marles a question. It wasn't a question. It was actually more of a statement where he had said that he disagreed with the narrative in Richard Marles's speech, and he disagreed on 2 points. The first point is that their recent PLA punishment drills, so labelled by the PLA, in the vicinity of Taiwan, which we spoke about in our last episode, were not about punishing Taiwan citizens. He said, and I quote, they were about punishing a few Taiwanese separatists. Taiwan, in fact, relies on the PLA to protect them. So I thought that was interesting correction of Richard Marles' speech. Obviously, Richard Marles didn't agree. And then the second one was a reference to China's activity in the West Philippine EEZ and effectively disagreeing with Richard Marles' comment about their aggression. So, look, I think overall takeaway, it was intense, Shangri-La. So it was good to see that communication was obviously a theme of the dialogue. We saw China's Defence Minister speak with the US Defence Secretary of State, Lloyd Austin, and China's Defence Minister speak with the Deputy Prime Minister from Australia, Richard Marles. So I think that was positive, and that's important communication. I think worthwhile pulling out the transcript from China's Defence Minister for those that are interested. I think that speech was pretty concerning. Been a lot written about it in the last week, including a good piece by Professor Rory Medcalf in the AFR. There were a number of not-so-veiled threats, and two things kind of stood to mind in that speech. The first one was talking about Taiwan, where he said that Taiwanese separatists would be nailed to the pillar of shame in history. And also that anyone that sought to interfere with the reunification of Taiwan would face self-destruction or total destruction. I've forgotten which word, but you get the point. The third thing I thought was stark from that speech was both in reference to Taiwan and reference to the Philippines. China's Defence Minister was at pains to stress that whilst he thought that China had been restrained on both accounts, which I would disagree with, that they were reaching their limits, and there were limits. And so I think that's probably the bit of the speech that hasn't been written about so much, but is probably one of the most influential, and I took that as a warning as well. Beyond that, I think the other thing of note was President Marcos from the Philippines speech on the Friday night. There was a really key point in that, where he was asked a question about what would be the threshold for China's actions in the West Philippine Sea being considered an armed attack or an attack of war, something that would instigate a significant response from the Philippines and potentially bring into conversation the Mutual Defence Treaty between the Philippines and the US. On this point, President Marcos was really clear. I think this is the most clarity we've had from the Philippines, and it was in response to a direct question about it. But basically, he said that if there was a death of a Philippine citizen as a result of China's aggression, he would consider that crossing the Rubicon or a red line and being an armed attack. And he was certainly of the view in his response that he had spoken to the US about this, and then they were aligned on that point. So a clear threshold being outlined there. And we do know that there have been a number of Philippine sailors that have been injured by the use of the water cannon from China. Interestingly, when Lloyd Austin was asked the same question in the forum after his speech, he said, "I'm not going to deal in hypotheticals." So we didn't get that clarity from the US, but certainly we did from the president of the Philippines. So I think overall, an interesting Shangri-La. I didn't walk away from it feeling that we are in a happy place in the Indo-Pacific. I certainly walked away from it with a sense of the tensions and a view that although my position is that conflict is not probable in the region, it is certainly more likely than it was a couple of years ago and continues to deteriorate. And I think that the speeches at Shangri-La Dialogue kind of resonated that. What were your takeaways, Richard, from what you saw about the coverage of Shangri-La?
As I say, I didn't have the benefit of being in the room. You do get a very different kind of sense being there, and I've only looked at some of the transcripts and not at all of them. But I think it's this sense of polarization was one of the things that came through quite clearly. Obviously, Marcos's speech was indicative of this quite strong, relatively recent, or sort of increasingly strong Philippines position. At the same time, the Chinese defense minister's speech, as you say, very sort of fiery in places, really quite concerningly so. I do wonder how much, and I think it's always worth keeping in mind, particularly with the Chinese, who's the audience for this?
Mm-hmm.
To what degree is there a domestic audience? And you only have to think that the lifespan, certainly in terms of position of these type of Chinese positions, whether it's defense minister, foreign minister, at the moment has not been long. And there is a very sort of significant domestic audience for this. So I guess that's maybe looking for some silver linings where there may be none, or different types of challenges. But I think that's perhaps worth keeping in mind that they're not necessarily, some of that real vitriol is not necessarily immediately targeted at the obvious external audience. The other thing I thought was quite interesting was stuff like the Australian, Japanese, South Korean trilateral, which was held on the side of the summit. So this is something I think that is a really interesting kind of development, and these connections between what one might describe as the Indo-Pacific middle powers, I think is something that is worth keeping an eye on, and is obviously an ongoing kind of trend, but that kind of deepening of those connections, I think is again part of that polarization to a degree, but something that I think we would broadly see as positive. The other thing I did think, and I'm going to put this out there because I thought Miles's speech was very good, and everything else, but previously at these type of events and elsewhere, I've certainly have noted, and others, how Australia's position in some ways has been almost slightly ahead of the American one. And I think, again, you are seeing quite a very firm line coming out of the Australian government. I view that as good, but I think there is a concern, and there remains a concern to which Australia is almost, as I say, ahead of the United States, and the critique that has been made before is that Australia is speaking loudly and carrying a small stick. I'm still in two minds about elements of that, and I have openly critiqued it previously, so I feel like I need to wear it when I say actually I was very I thought Miles's speech was very good, but there is that element there.
Look, I agree. I think that if you took the theme away from Lloyd Austin's speech, he was talking about partnerships, that lattice work framework of partnerships across the region, how important that was. That was his key point. I don't think he actually, I'd have to check, but I don't think he really mentioned the word China too much in his speech. He did actually mention Australia. Australia featured very prominently in his speech. I think we're probably the most mentioned country. Miles' speech, I think, a lot of stuff about the international rules-based order, which has become standard in an Australian government speech. But I think the point, to your point about are we leading with our chin a little bit, there was a very direct message calling out China's support for Russia and asking China to act as a responsible great power. was really the key message I took from Bas's speech. He did also talk about how important China is to the region, how important the Australia-China relationship is, and how China's significant economic development has helped uplift countries around the region, and how essential that was to the region. But I think he was very clear on China's support for Russia, which stood out. And I think it really did stand out. I agree with the point. I think it was a good point to be made. It was clearly for an audience of Southeast Asian neighbours who are hedging. But it was very much at odds with the leaders from Southeast Asia, both from Malaysia, the president-elect from Indonesia, Prabowo, who actually focused more on the Israel-Gaza conflict. The Prime Minister from Malaysia referred to it as a genocide. The President from Indonesia talked about the fact that Indonesia would be willing to send peacekeeping troops when both sides agree. But they also talked about the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But in their characterisation, Shangri-La, of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, it was a very different characterisation to Australia's. So I thought there was an interesting divide there. Moving on to, I guess, what else has happened in the region this week, Richard?
So one of the sort of other points which has been picked up, and I think is fits into a trend we've been talking about before, was the Chinese response to the airdropping of supplies to Philippines forces based on Second Thomas Shoal, and the photos, and I've not actually seen. I think there's a video, but I've not seen it.
Yes.
Of Chinese ribs coming and basically trying to seize all of the supplies being dropped to the Philippines forces, and then there was some back and forth, particularly with the Global Times, as always, contributing its wondrous takes on these things about whether or not the Philippines drew firearms and what that means, and all of this kind of back and forth. Now, you might know more than I do about the precise nature of the resupply issue, but it seems to fit into this continuing kind of ramping up of pressure on the Chinese side. Whilst in some ways it very much fits into that kind of narrative, it does once again raise the temperature. To my mind, you look at these kind of things and you think, at what point is there a real potential for a misjudgment or something to go wrong, and issues to spin out of control from there. Now, I'm not normally somebody who particularly sort of believes very much in a lot of that kind of rhetoric, but the more you see these type of interactions, the more scope there is for something to go wrong. What was your take on it from a much more operator's kind of perspective?
Yeah, look, I agree. So I think I saw in the reporting that the Chinese ribs that were intercepting and ripping apart the resupply packages, which contained food and things like that, got within 5 meters of the Sierra Madre. Certainly that's the Philippines' position. And so in accordance with the Philippines' ROE, rules of engagement, they drew their weapons. Now, I think that's a fairly reasonable response from the Philippines. A difficult one, though, because the narrative as it's been spun by China it doesn't represent great images. But in the end, those Marines on that dilapidated Sierra Madre do need to protect themselves. So I think it's a reasonable response. But I think it goes to your point about how much the region is escalating. I think, it actually occurred before Shangri-La, but came out in the press after Shangri-La. And I think on the back of Shangri-La, I think it shows that, these dynamics are not changing anytime soon. They're not improving anytime soon. And one of the interesting things, I'll just go back to Shangri-La for a moment, but there wasn't a lot of public support from the leaders in their speeches from the Southeast Asian nations for the Philippines in terms of their response here. There was from Japan, there was from the Republic of Korea, there was from Europe, there was from Australia, there was from the US, but it was a notable absence in the speeches from Malaysia and Indonesia, etc. So I think that it is polarizing the region in terms of the response from the Philippines and China's aggression, and it's a problem that is not going away anytime soon and ripe for escalation. And I think it's a really important point that President Marcos made about what would the Philippines view as an armed attack. So it is, concerning.
So, Jem, lots happening in the region, but also moving on to what gets me always really excited, talking about capability, and in this case, talking about AUKUS. My students always claim I never shut up about AUKUS, but that's probably a fair read. Jonathon Mead gave an interview of sorts to a couple of different outlets, letting on a few more bits and pieces about how the AUKUS program's going. What was your kind of take on his comments?
Asked Mr. Strategist with an interview with Vice Admiral Mead, obviously the head of the Australian Submarine Agency that was established last year. So it does give us some more clarity. So certainly when we talk about the AUKUS optimal pathway for Pillar 1, we had previously heard conversations about Virginia class being anywhere between 3 to 5 for Australia. Now that had started to narrow in 3 in some of the conversation, but what we did get from Mead was clarity. So the intent is for 3 Virginia class from Australia in the 30s. And then the building of 5 SSN AUKUS in conjunction with the UK, taking us out to 2054. So there had been some thought that maybe it was 8 SSN AUKUS, but the plan is 3 Virginias and 5 SSN AUKUS, so that's more clarity. The other point that was interesting was that there was reference from Admiral Mead to SSN AUKUS being quite a large submarine, so a 10,000-ton submarine. And I think I cringe when I hear 10,000 tons because it always makes me think of the Hunter class. But 10,000-ton submarine, which is much larger than a Virginia, which is about 7,000 tons, and a Collins class, which is about 3,300 tons. So that is interesting. Discussion too about it being an evolution of the Astute, but with much more commonality with US systems. So more clarity there from on SSN AUKUS. Mead also highlighted that he was of the view that we were on track for the optimal pathway and pointed to the training that is occurring in the States. So 100 officers going through the US this year who will then move on to US boats to get practical experience in US SSNs. There was also, in some of the interviews, an interview with a US guy called Dan Packer. He's a former Navy captain who's now the US Director of Naval Submarine Forces for AUKUS, so pretty much in the know. And he highlighted that one of his key focuses was helping Australia build its submarine force from about 800 personnel that it is currently to about 3,000 personnel that it will need for SSN AUKUS. I feel like 3,000 personnel is probably an underestimate. I had estimated previously about 3,500, but either way, quite a challenge. Interestingly, he talked about the fact that he was of the view that at one point there would be at least 440 Australian sailors and officers serving on US submarines getting that practical experience. So a bit more clarity on SSN AUKUS. Anything I missed in that one, Richard, that we should highlight?
No, I think that's a lot of the kind of the key points. There's other bits and pieces about kind of greater integration, even down to use of Australian steel. I take some of that with a slight pinch of salt. The key message I got out of this, and I think you've already flagged it, is that Mead was really pushing the line that this is on track, right? And that for all of the ups and downs, and we can talk a little bit about some of those in a second, the overall project is on track, which I thought was interesting. The flag of the 10,000-ton submarine, again, I thought was quite notable. Like, in certain regards, this fits with a trend of submarines getting larger, but 10,000 tons is a big submarine by anyone's standards. And it's particularly notable when part of the debate that's gone on in terms of Australian submarine capability for going back to, well, certainly back to Collins, if not before, is the fact that a lot of the waters in which Australian submarines potentially operate are relatively shallow, relatively confined, and do you want a really big submarine? So all of these kind of debates that we've been hashed over numerous times, it's very clear where we've ended up, whether or not that fits with what the actual operational requirements may or may not be. I think depends on circumstances which we cannot predict. But it is interesting where we have ended up in terms of very much a kind of open ocean, deep water, very large submarine. So that I noted. The other point that flagged with me, and it's something I've been kind of keeping a track on, is around the size and scale of this program more broadly. And one kind of way I like to measure it is by looking actually at the size of the ASA. And the way in which the ASA itself is growing. It's already up to 597 people, it was stated. It's going to over 1,000 this is a big beast, just the agency itself, not including everything else that's involved, all the workers and all of the external stuff. This is obviously outside of Navy as well. And this feeds into something that I've often seen as a risk in this, which is the degree to which AUKUS, as a mega project, ends up kind of sucking resources and everything else and oxygen generally out of defence and the defence space. So again, Mead's message very much this is on track, but those sorts of indicators are something that I think is worth keeping an eye on. And in terms of that sort of thing, the other point, the AUKUS point, I thought that we should potentially flag was, which I guess fits into this sense of it being on track, was the news coming out of the House in Congress that, having seen all of these debates about whether or not they're going to order 1 or 2 Virginias, and the idea was sort of, it was the Navy only asked for 1, then House Armed Services Committee bumped that up to 2, and now the House Appropriations Bill has pulled it back down to 1 again. And the point which I guess I would make about this is that I don't actually think the number itself matters at all in the grand scheme of things, but I do think that the politics and the visuals and the imagery of this do matter. And so Mead's message, this is very much on track. These are the kind of the asteroids, as it were, the things that they can't control, and they are still very much out there. So that would be my kind of AUKUS in a nutshell for the week. What about you? What were your kind of wider views?
I agree. I will give a shameless plug here. I did have a piece out in the Fin Review last week talking about AUKUS. It's actually before Mead's interview, but talking about how I think it's largely on track. I'll be honest, I've kind of stopped following the debates about 1 versus 2 in the US Congress, and that's 1 versus 2 Virginias being made this year. To be honest, as I say in this piece, I don't think that actually will influence the transfer of Virginia class to Australia in the 30s. I think this is a much bigger issue than whether the US has the, I think it's 63 SSNs they want to be operating by 2054 or something like that. They're not going to get there, but I don't think that means Australia doesn't get its 3. But check out that piece. Given the time, I won't go into it. Another shameless plug, though, if it is, don't pay for the Fin Review. You should. But if you don't, the piece Without a Firewall is also available on my website. So I guess moving on from AUKUS, submarines seem to be the flavour of the last 2 weeks. What's been happening with the Collins class, our current submarines?
I was going to say, we've been we talked about Collins and the Collins LOTE, I think in our last episode. The LOTE is the life of type extension, this big major refit they're going to undergo in order to, perhaps I would say, eke out the life of these boats in order to get them to where the new capabilities, whether that be Virginia or then potentially SS and AUKUS, will take over. And so there's been quite a lot of discussion about that after we flagged a couple of weeks ago that actually this hadn't been talked about that much. It's been very much now in the headlines. So the first element of this, I guess, was the reports coming from ASC, the company that does all of the maintenance for these things, that as they've taken them out of the water, they found considerably greater corrosion on the hulls in certain places of, I think it was Sheehan and Farncombe. Farncombe in particular is the second oldest of the Collins class and is going to be the first one to go in for the life of type extension. Now, there was quite a lot of, I would say, perhaps slightly breathless reporting about this. I went back because I hadn't listened to the full Senate estimates meeting, so I went back and listened to it all, and actually the comments from ASC suggested that actually this was perhaps slightly less of an issue than some of the reporting had flagged, which, again, not entirely surprising. Again, also ASC are going to say that, aren't they? So always taking this with a pinch of salt, but it's certainly not a good sign, right? It does feed into this concern that these are old submarines, and old submarines have issues. And you've only got to look at the Argentines and the Indonesians and others to see that if you don't look after old submarines, and even if you do look after old submarines, there can be problems. The other element of this was we got a little bit more detail about what was going to be in the Collins LOTE. So this is this big refit. We've not got the full details as to what they're going to be doing, but we know what they're not going to be doing. And two elements that have been dropped is one, it was going to get a new optronic mast, so basically a new, much better periscope. You're going to tell me all my submarining details here are incorrect, but this was a French-designed Sanfran optronic mast, which they're used in most of the new submarines. So the Virginias and the Astutes, for example, both have optronic masts. These mean that you don't have to have a hole through the pressure hull to go for a optical periscope to go through. No surprise in many respects. The key reason why they went with this optronic mast and the reason it was part of the LOTE was because it was a step on towards, this was the kit that was going to be in the next generation of attack class submarines. In many ways, I think most people were a bit surprised that decisions hadn't been made on this earlier. It seemed like an odd hangover, so no real surprise that it got axed. The thing that perhaps was slightly larger in terms of the impact was the announcement that they're not going to be fitted with Tomahawk land attack missiles. So originally, the plan was to integrate these into Collins. You could fire them through the torpedo tubes in the same way that the Brits do with the Astute. This would be a really big and quite significant capability upgrade, particularly within the frame of Miles's impactful projection and everything else. So not doing this is, I think, is a significant step back in some regards in capability. Notably, again, thinking that, okay, the Virginias coming online supposedly in the early 2030s will have this capability, but one Virginia doesn't make a capability. So there's issues there. But again, in certain respects, this was always looked like a slightly risky kind of thing.
Okay.
The Americans don't fire Tomahawks in this way anymore, or they've only got a few submarines left that do. And notably, they don't manufacture the missiles to be fired in this way anymore. So it was always kind of fitting in a almost orphan capability into an old submarine. So there were questions there for some time. But I think more broadly, my main thing I would say is that all of this news has just fitted into, none of it's particularly surprising, but all of it has fitted into a wider sense of slight concern about Collins as a capability going forward, and what actually is the LOTE going to be doing? Are these going to be effectively warfighting capabilities well into the 2030s, or is this more about eking out a training platform? And I think that we don't really know where defence is at, but there's certain flags there. Anyway, lots of detail. What was your kind of take on it all?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with you. None of it was surprising. The nature of the rust, I thought, that was mentioned by AXC, not being a rust or a submarine expert. Certainly, having been the XO of a decommissioning ship, we just painted over the rust. A joke. But look, it wasn't much of a surprise, to be honest. The removal of Tomahawk as part of the LOTE plan, look, it really seems like it hadn't necessarily had the analysis behind it to see how feasible it was to really integrate it. And I don't think tactically we would have employed the Collins class in that way anyway. Quite a slow vessel, a conventional submarine. So if you're going to fire a missile and give away your location, you want to be able to get away from that fast, which would not be the case. And we are integrating them into the Hobart. And I think actually Chief of Navy said at estimates last week, or certainly reported, I didn't watch it, this week, that we will have our first Tomahawks integrated into a Hobart by the end of the year. So nothing really surprising. In terms of the Collins class, obviously they've provided a great capability over their lifetime. I think largely the view would be, how do we maintain a submarine workforce and a baseline capability for training and operations until we get through to the 30s? I think that the point now is really to limp the capability through. Would be what I'm picking up by a lot of these changes. What else has been happening in capability this week?
So returning briefly to AUKUS, one thing that flagged with me as being quite interesting, talking about AUKUS Pillar 2, was a snippet of an interview talking about one of the first AUKUS Pillar 2 capabilities to actually kind of reach the sailors, aviators, and soldiers. I try absolutely to avoid the word warfighter because I find it gives me the creepy crawlies. And that is the integration of P8 sonar data. So P8's maritime patrol craft, aircraft that are operated by the UK, Australia, and the US. These drop sonar buoys, which pick up signals and acoustic data from submarines. This is super kind of highly classified type information. This is a means by which this information is going to be shared. We were talking before we came on live about actually how much of this is kind of super high tech, snazzy AUKUS Pillar 2 style advanced capabilities. I'm not so sure, but in terms of as a statement about AUKUS and this kind of closer integration of these three countries, I think it does say a lot. And to my mind, this might be an area actually where Pillar 2 is almost more about the trust and the integration than it is about the quantum supercomputer that's going to win the war for you. So I think there's perhaps something quite interesting there. We'll see more later on. I guess particularly from an Australian point of view, though, the scale is really important. The Americans have 120 P8s. We have 12 and the Brits have 9, right? Being able to engage with the scale of American capability there is good. So that was one little snippet. You've already mentioned about integration of Tomahawk onto the Hobarts. We saw some pictures, I think, yesterday or today of other integration of new kit onto the Hobarts.
Yeah, so the Australian Defence Magazine put out some photos of HMAS Sydney with NSM clearly installed. We knew from the fleet review recommendations that were launched in February that the plan was to expedite the integration of NSM, so the Naval Strike Missile, into the fleet. So that's good to see. Certainly in estimates this week, it sounds like the Chief of Navy said that the intent was to continue this. We have a number of ships with the capability by the end of the year. But didn't mention much detail about it whatsoever. A good enhancement in terms of range. I keep hearing NSM referred to as part of our impactful projection and long-range strike. Naval Strike Missile is a good missile. It's not a long-range missile. I think 200 kilometers or something like that. Really similar range, to be honest, to the Harpoon, but a much more modern version and capability. So it is certainly an upgrade. An important upgrade and one that I personally think we probably should have embarked on years ago. I am keen to see in future plans whether there is a plan to construct the Naval Strike Missile in Australia. I think that's something that would be quite exciting. Certainly, we've heard nothing about that so far, but it does seem feasible, and we really do need our GUIO project, which has been talked about much since the Force Structure Plan, and every year we hear new announcements like it's a new thing. To start making some sort of ordnance. So that would be a good future thing. But yeah, great to see Sydney with NSM embarked. So let's go to our weekly Did You Know? So I think you're going to give the Did You Know this week, talking about Australian Army Watercraft.
Yes, absolutely. The Australian Army coming out of the DSR is dramatically expanding its kind of watercraft capability under a project of Land 8710. So getting lots and lots of new boaty things. Now, I thought it'd be interesting to think about this in terms of historical context. A lot of this is framed as being kind of radically new, but the Australian Army actually has quite a long history of successfully using watercraft, including in operations. So I thought we'd look at the Second World War, which is where they did this on kind of greater scale. So coming into the Second World War and during the early part of the Second World War, the Army actually didn't really do boats. They didn't like doing that sort of thing. And so you get into the early part of 1942, mid-1942, when the Army is being called back to Australia and looking to operate in the Southwest Pacific. And they are asking Navy basically to provide them with small watercraft. And as the Army note in one of the kind of official documents afterwards, as they put it, the Navy were quite incompetent in their efforts. So Navy didn't give them the watercraft that they wanted. So after a while and a bit of tense negotiation, Army take over everything up to 300 tons. And so Army start doing this in late 1942, 1943. They're a bit behind the 8 ball, so they try and requisition any kind of civilian craft. The trouble is that the Navy's had first bite. The US Army has come along in early 1942 and hoovered up most of what's left. So the Army take up all of these random assortment of vessels, from ferries to schooners to luggers, launches, anything like this. Now, these are a nightmare in many respects. Some of them are really old and all sorts of things, but they are essential to some of the really early operations in New Guinea and in terms of helping the Army operate and build its base in northern Australia, where rail connections and other things are really poor and roads are really poor. After this, they then begin building lots of this stuff in Australia. So we think a lot about sort of shipbuilding in Australia. We don't think about this side of things. I was shocked when I heard the numbers involved. So they build a new wave of cargo vessels, lighters, landing craft, other things. Some of this is built in shipyards. A lot of it's built in things like the Holden factory in Ford and these kind of places. By October 1943, the Army had received 29 vessels, but they had a further 846 craft on order. So huge scale of this kind of thing. And just some kind of numbers to highlight its importance to all of these sort of logistics and operations. Between 1942 and 1945, they carried, so the Army Water Transport Service carried 1 million tons of cargo, nearly 1.5 million men, on 141,000 journeys covering 3 million kilometers. So my takeaway and the end to my did you know here is that even to the Army in our region, maritime matters. I think that's where we'll wrap it up, and we'll have a chat again next week and bring more snippets from maritime events both in the region and in terms of capability. So thank you for listening, and thanks a lot, Jen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Richard. Chat next week.